fantastic opportunity for me to see the workings of the Catholic Church in its heart and its headquarters, and the Roman Curia, and it's a glimpse behind sort of walls that we wouldn't normally get to see behind from a distance.
Absolutely, the program was conceived really well. It really seems to address a lot of the issues that the press is really concerned about with this pontificate so far. So it's great to have some insights that you don't get otherwise, or they're not so easy to access.
The point is, I never expected that the people will be so open to all the questions that as a Muslim I wanted to know.
I've been able to hear directly from major church leaders about the kinds of news that we're going to be covering in the next year in this really interesting time in the church, but also just being able to be here in Rome and be saturated in these ideas. That's been incredibly helpful.
Welcome everyone to this special session of the Church Up Close in Rome. My name is Father John Wauck. I'm a professor of literature and the communication of the faith at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, in the School of Church Communications, where we strive to train people who are going to work in church communications in the professional capacity, but we also, as part of our department's efforts, help journalists to cover the Catholic Church, especially here in Rome. And over the years, we've had many programs designed to do that, to provide journalists with information and perspectives that are going to help them. And we came up with the Church Up Close essentially as a way to assist journalists who don't live in Rome to get to know the church up close by coming to Rome for an intensive one-week seminar. This year, we're unable to do that because of the COVID restrictions. The organization of the conference was altered by the restrictions and the uncertainties about the policies of the government here. And so what we're doing is having two special sessions this week and next week. And the first of them is our interview today with Cardinal Pell, whom we're very privileged to have with us. Before we begin, I also want to thank in a special way our sponsor, which is our Sunday Visitor Institute, based in Huntington, Indiana. For those of you from around the world who are unfamiliar with our Sunday Visitor, it's the only weekly Catholic newspaper in the United States and one of the largest Catholic publishers in the entire world. So we're very grateful to them for their help this year and also in the years past in making the Church Up Close possible. And now we're going to have, as I say, this interview with His Eminence Cardinal Pell. And I want to ask Ashely Noronha to introduce the Cardinal.
Well, thank you, Father Wauck. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today. And of course, I wish that you all were able to be here with us here in Bella Roma, but hopefully that will happen soon enough. So as Father mentioned, I'm Ashely Noronha. I'm the Rome correspondent with Relevant Radio out of the United States. And I've been enjoying living here in Rome for the past 13 years, and being part of the Church Up Close for so many of those years as well. And today I am happy to introduce to you our guest, Cardinal George Pell. It was 4 years ago in 2017 that Cardinal George Pell left the Vatican Secretariat of the Economy, where he served as prefect, to face charges of sexual molestation allegedly occurring in his Melbourne cathedral in 1996. After a mistrial in 2018, a second trial convicted him. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Cardinal Pell was then incarcerated for 404 days until the High Court of Australia found him not guilty of all charges and unanimously acquitted and released him in April of 2020. Here at the Vatican, the investigation by the Holy See's Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith into the allegations of abuse also concluded upon his acquittal by the High Court. Now, that's the part you probably already know. But what you might not know is that Cardinal Pell was also quite an athlete. In fact, he was a talented Australian rules football player in his youth, and in 1959 signed a contract to play professionally for the Richmond Football Club. But God got to him first, and he decided to study for the priesthood instead. After ordination in 1966, Cardinal Pell earned a PhD in church history from the University of Oxford, as well as a master's degree in education from Monash University in Melbourne. In 1985, he was appointed the rector of Corpus Christi College and served the faithful in rural Victoria and Melbourne. He chaired Caritas Australia from 1988 to 1997. Cardinal Pell was appointed as a delegate to the Australian Constitutional Convention in 1998. He received the Centenary Medal from the Australian government in 2003 and was appointed a companion of the Order of Australia in 2005. And 7 years before sexual scandals at the American Church were exposed by the spotlight reports of the Boston Globe, Cardinal Pell had already set up the Melbourne Response Protocol in 1996 to investigate and deal with complaints of child sexual abuse in the Archdiocese. Meanwhile, here in Rome, in 2014, Pope Francis appointed Cardinal Pell to head the newly established Secretariat for the Economy, a Vatican office that would oversee and have authority over all financial activities of the Holy See and Vatican City State. And this came on the heels of scandals involving the Vatican Bank, including the arrest of a senior Vatican accountant for corruption and on money laundering charges. As prefect for the Secretariat of the Economy, Cardinal Pell unveiled plans for a major overhaul of the Vatican Bank and called for a significant reduction in the size and scope of its operations, as well as the implementation of measures like regular external audits to ensure financial transparency. This year, Cardinal Pell celebrates 55 years of priesthood and 34 years as a bishop. As bishop, he served the Diocese of Sydney and Melbourne. He was made cardinal by Pope John Paul II in 2003. He's authored several books on faith and morals, and his 2 latest books come from the notes he made during his time in incarceration. Prison Journal, Volume 1 and 2, with Volume 3, The High Court Frees an Innocent Man, to be released next month by Ignatius Press. Cardinal Pell, Your Eminence, we thank you so much for this opportunity to have this discussion with you, and we welcome you to the Church Up Close, covering Catholicism in the age of Pope Francis.
Thank you, Ashely. Thank you.
And with that, I turn it over to you, Father Wauck.
Okay, well, I think for the first question, I think I just want to play off the very impressive introduction, biographical introduction
Very
that
kind.
we just heard. Starting with what Ashely said at the beginning about the experience of prison, which you've already written extensively about in the diaries, but not everyone has able to read those diaries, and so I wondered if you could share with us, some insights to what you've taken away from that extraordinary, harrowing experience.
Well, I think the first thing I would have to say, it wasn't as bad as it might have been, or you might think it was. I didn't have hostile guards. I didn't have hours of interrogation. They weren't keeping the lights on all night or anything like that. But certainly it wasn't you weren't at a holiday farm or an expensive hotel.
You were unable to celebrate Mass.
I was unable to celebrate Mass. That was a a major deprivation, but they allowed me to keep my breviary from the very first night. And I had to give up my rosary because it was made of metal, but I eventually received a prison issue rosary, which was made of material. What do I learn from it? Well, I've said to it once or twice, the package works, the Christian package works. And like many Christians who find themselves in difficult situations, when you find yourself in whatever situation it might be, a parent with a very sick spouse or a very sick child, you just put one foot after the other and do what you're supposed to do. So I said my prayers, had a regular routine, exercise, slept. I was able to sleep well. I had a firm base on and not a very thick mattress, but it was okay.
Not everyone knows how prison beds are.
That's right. But mine, the bed was long enough, and that's a major thing. I had a hot shower. The water was hot, and two worldly luxuries that you don't get on retreat. I generally haven't. One was a refrigerator, and not a refrigerator, a kettle, and a television. So all in all.
And were you able to talk with people while you were there?
No,
You had no visitors?
I had visitors twice a week.
Twice a week.
From a small list that I had to issue. My only human contact was with the warders, and they were almost universally, they were always polite and almost universally cordial. So and I think it wasn't just with me. There were a dozen of us in isolation, many of them badly wounded, anguished, angry, many of them damaged terribly from drugs. And I think the warders dealt with them. It was a very hard job, but dealt with them regularly on a decent and humane basis.
And did you have any contact with the other prisoners?
Towards the last 3 or 4 months, I was able to have limited contact with 3 others who were all very kind to me. 2 of them were Muslims.
Right.
One of the Muslims gave me a sort of a Muslim catechism, which I read with interest. I was surprised at how well written it was, how sophisticated. It was a good piece of work.
But it's not an experience you would recommend to anyone.
No, not at all, not at all. No, you're at the bottom of the pile. There are regularly small humiliations, small and greater.
Sure.
And oh no, it's not as I said, not a holiday camp.
And were you always confident of vindication in the courts, or?
No. I knew I should have been, logically.
But
no, I wasn't. And after the Victorian Supreme Court found against me, for a little while, I was a little bit tempted to say, well, look, if the judges are just going to close ranks, this is an expensive charade. It costs too much money. Why play along with it? But the head of the jail spoke to me, and he said, no,
appeal.
He said appeal, and he said the dissenting judgment of Justice Weinberg, he said, is a magnificent basis for that. So I've gone through life. I did church history, as Ashely mentioned, and I used to say that if I would like to have written one book, it was Peter Brown's Life of Augustine. And I've now added to that, said I would like to have written the dissenting judgment of Weinberg, because it's a very fine piece of work.
That's wonderful.
How has your experience changed you?
I don't want to get into trouble, but I don't think I've improved much. One person said I might have mellowed, perhaps. Obviously, it's got to change you. Please God, I was always tried to be interested in serious things. Please God, my sense of values has been simplified a bit. I'm very, very grateful for the gift of faith,
Yes.
for the belief that the good God is in charge of it all, that the ultimate judgment is the one we meet at death and on the last day. I mean, if for a person who had no concept of the afterlife or no concept of a God who was good and just, if you were beaten in the legal contest in this world, there's nothing else. And I think I mentioned in my journals, for years and years, I read Greek tragedy with Catholic spectacles, sort of thinking that there was a heaven, but for them, of course, there's no such thing. That's it. And no concept of redemptive suffering, which is fundamental to Christianity.
Absolutely.
Listening to Ashely's introduction, it's impossible not to notice that you've seen a lot and been in many, many places over the course of your life in Australia and Europe and England and Rome. And I was wondering if you could comment on the different ways in which the church is seen and understood in different parts of the world, the church and its social context, or even the life of the church itself in England, Australia, Europe. Rome, of course, is somewhat sui generis, but what would you say about that?
Well, the situation is very obviously different, substantially different in even in Europe. I mean, the religious situation in Malta or in Italy is different from the religious situation in East Germany or Belgium or Holland.
Or Poland.
Or Poland. In Australia, Catholics have always been a minority, about 25%. In the early days, the colonial authorities were frightened that our percentage was going up beyond 25%. Most were Irish Catholics then. So there's a history of tension between Protestant English and Catholic Irish in Australia. That is no longer a significant tension. The significant tension in Australia, as it is, I think, right through the English-speaking world and more generally, between a secular point of view and a Judeo-Christian point of view.
Did that play a role in your trial?
It might have. I think I've sometimes said that the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, have become WASSers. White Anglo-Saxon secularists. And there is a residual anti-Catholicism, especially against conservative Catholics, because the church, the Catholic Church, is recognized as the most significant opponent of this sort of, these rampaging changes on life and family and sexuality, which I think are doing so much damage in our society, and especially to our young people. But that's another story.
And in England and Rome, the way the church is seen in those places?
Well, in Italy, the church is such a cultural presence. And even a lot of the ordinary Catholics think, no matter how bad the situation is, we've been there and done that and we've survived. Occasionally, I'm tempted to think that a percentage of the leadership of the church in Italy really doesn't know what's hitting them. Because, you know, the run on faith amongst the young people is significant. But there are so many movements who are so strong, so many parishes who are so, there's enormous reserves of strength. Even my book, my prison diaries, got more of a run in the secular Italian papers than it did in the secular Australian papers,
Is that right?
where there's been a level of censorship.
Interesting.
Now in England, they still have the established church. There's enormous hidden strengths in the Catholic Church in England. 500 priests signed a petition about divorce and remarriage and difficulties of communion for the divorced and remarried without annulment. 500 priests in the UK.
Yeah.
Now, we would never have got a number like that.
Didn't the
in
bishop
Australia.
just become a Catholic last month, I believe? A bishop in England, an Anglican bishop,
I hadn't heard that,
entered the
but
church. Yeah.
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, they've had hundreds of Anglican clergy come and join the Catholic priesthood. It's been a real vocations boost.
Playing off that one last point that was mentioned in the biography, as people now associate you with the problems with the sex abuse crisis and with economic reform in the Vatican. But Ashely mentioned that you did a doctorate in church history at Oxford. While you were there, you were a chaplain at Eton. And a few years ago, and it was 2014, I believe, you did a televised debate in Australia with Richard Dawkins, the sort of propagandizing atheist biologist,
Yes.
and more than held your own. And I was wondering if you could comment on the intellectual climate in which the church finds itself now, faced with an aggressive secularist, an atheistic agenda on some parts. What does the church, where does the church stand now with regard to the intellectual milieu of the age?
Well, that varies enormously, very obviously. But the need for young lay people to be culturally equipped to dialogue about our situation is even more important than ever. So I think the importance of the small liberal arts colleges in the United States, we have one in Australia, the importance of Catholic chaplaincies at the universities, these can't be
To instruct the new generation.
Yes, because they're see, we need to examine our secular society as closely as people examine Christianity. And people are often very well aware of the failings of Christians, but don't turn the spotlight on and say, what's happening to our young people?
Sure.
The level of nervous disease, depression, the level of suicides in Australia. We've got a wonderful country. It's the third or fourth highest suicide rate for young males in the world.
Is that right?
So
what's going on?
Yes, what's going on? And I'm a great admirer of the American sociologist Eberstadt, is it? Mary Eberstadt. And just recently she addressed the Catholic social scientists in the United States, a brilliant paper about just what's going on in the world around us. Because we have this very strange phenomenon of the woke, the cancel culture, which is stronger in the English-speaking countries.
Right.
So up until the Second World War, communism and Nazism was much stronger on the continent and in Russia, of course, in parts of Asia, than it was in the English-speaking world. But this particular outbreak of barbarism is for the moment stronger in the English-speaking countries, perhaps particularly in the United States, UK, not quite as bad in Australia. But I think there's a real role for the church to talk about the importance of truth, because unless there's a truth that you can get to through dialogue and debate, if there's just my truth and your truth, and it's decided by what tribe you come from or the application of power, there's not really much point in chatting together or arguing.
Yeah. In that debate with Dawkins, as I recall, one of the few things that you agreed upon was the importance of truth, that it matters whether God exists or not. We have to arrive at an answer to that. Did you feel that there was a possibility for dialogue with Dawkins?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, we dialogued or argued, I don't know, for an hour or so. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think we would both agree that nothing has changed by whether I agree, I believe there's a man in the moon or not. The man in the moon is there or not, and God is there or not, quite independent of our understandings.
Mm-hmm. Your Eminence, as you know, our audience is made of hundreds of journalists from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at your personal experiences with the media, what would you say that in general, the media tends to cover well about the Catholic Church, and the opposite, what tends to be forgotten about the Church?
Well, it depends what part of the Church a bit you are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the English-speaking world, the press generally is sensitive and open to a lot of the good work we do with the poor and the suffering. But at least in Australia, their commentariat, the writers in our journals, even when the newspapers are, say, somewhat right of centre, they have a worldview which they've largely taken from the universities rather than from their parents. And it is very secular and doesn't comprehend too much, especially about godliness, about a transcendent creator God.
Right.
Prayer and sacrifice and so there's a significant incomprehension, and on the part of some people, of course, a relentless hostility.
Sure, sure. And it's, of course, hard to overcome that from a professional standpoint. And it's interesting because I've heard other cardinals and bishops say that one issue is that people are not necessarily trained to be able to cover the Catholic Church because there's just not that opportunity anymore. And so with that said, do you have suggestions? Do you have keys for journalists who want to cover the Church well, who may or may not be Catholic, how do they cover God? How do they cover the Church?
Well, I mean, the first thing is for them to want to do so. Because I was just talking to a reporter, and a person was working with the media. And sometimes, at least in Australia, some reporters will say, I don't do God. I don't really know much about that. I'm not really interested in finding out. Just give us a few basic ideas so I can ask a question or two. So the first thing is for the people to want to understand what we're about. And I mean, the Catholic story is a very interesting story, not always a happy or a good story, but a very interesting story.
Sure.
You don't survive for 2,000 years just through luck.
That's right.
And start with the New Testament, read what Jesus had to say, and then there's a host of marvelous reading for them to follow, to get a mentor who is a Christian and to suggest something that might meet their particular interest by way of books.
Definitely. You know, years ago, you said at a press conference that it is our responsibility to keep God in the news. And with that said, do you think church leaders in general have a good understanding of how to work with the media? And if not, how could that be improved?
Well, it varies an enormous amount. Some I've known bishops, who think they're a great success if they just keep out of the media, if they're not being attacked or they're just being left alone. But that's not a long-term tactic that is going to be productive in any way. I think the work that is being done at Santa Croce, the School of Communications, is absolutely vital. The more fundamental thing is for people to it's important for priests, for example, to know, have a good philosophical basis so they can argue, so they can reason, analyze, synthesize. It's important for lay Catholics too, who are going to contribute to the debate. So we've got to know what we're talking about religiously, and then, of course, get a little bit of practice and training, so that we can dialogue and talk on these things. Often the press, if we've got something to say in a way that is not conspicuously off-key or old-fashioned or pretty hopelessly irrelevant, they'll often give us generally give us coverage.
Yes, I've found that as well.
I recall once at one of the first Church Up Close meetings years ago, one of the journalists, who's by then actually was a professor at a very prestigious university in the United States, he was not Catholic. And after the week was over, he said, you know, I never really realized that Catholics believe that the church was founded by Jesus Christ, which it seems to me gives a sense of where you can start with some very basic ideas in terms of understand the self-understanding of the church. We take something like that for granted, but there's no reason to think that everyone else does.
No, well, I remember quite a senior journalist, a very competent woman. And I said to her, of course, we believe that God created the world and the universe. And she said, is that so?
Right.
And she wasn't playing. She was dead serious.
What do you think, what would you conclude from that kind of base knowledge, right? The absence of what we would take for granted. How does that affect the way that we have to communicate?
Well, it does, because you've got to know the people you're talking to. One of the hard things about preaching, that's almost unique amongst speakers, because you've got such a range of age, both sexes, educational levels in a mixed Catholic community. So I presume the descending level of understanding and knowledge of things religious, you need to spell out the basis that God is good, God is interested in us, God is rational, there is an afterlife, we believe in forgiveness. And I think especially with so much suffering about, that suffering can be redemptive. We believe that we're saved by Christ's death on the cross. Now that's a strange notion to people who aren't Christians.
And has your time in prison been an unexpected opportunity to make these things clearer?
I think it has. I think it has. Yeah, to me,
people listen to you in a different way, perhaps.
I don't know about that. They might. They might. I was once. I don't want to be frivolous, but I remember I said to a priest who was a good talker, I said, it's interesting, I found since I was a young bishop, but since I've become a bishop, people don't disagree with me as much as they did. He said, oh no, we're more used to bishops talking nonsense. So now it was a nice little piece of repartee. Right. It's a distraction and it doesn't contribute greatly to our discussion, but I couldn't resist.
You were speaking about redemptive suffering, and the reality too is that even that phrase, you said it's a strange concept to understand, but even the phrase itself is a particular jargon that is used within the church's circles. So one of the issues that journalists mention that they tend to have when trying to cover the church is trying to sort through all of the jargon, the 2,000 years of history that you mentioned, trying to read a thick encyclical when perhaps someone else has already summarized it for them and they can just work with that. But of course, it's a challenge to try to help journalists to go deep into these concepts and to figure out how to really penetrate all of these layers. And so the challenge is to figure out where to begin with this. And so I think what you said, going back to the basics, is a great way to start.
Yes, encyclicals are one thing, and their style and length, and that is an issue in itself. Generally, I think most priests and Catholic spokespersons are not too bad with jargon. We're normally not overloaded with acronyms and that sort of thing. But it's a gift, it's a result of years of training and thinking to be able to think clearly and state simply what you're trying to say. To be able to mean what you say and say what you mean is precious.
That's right. And to do it in a way that people can understand and hear.
And yes, and it's not off-putting. Now, that's a different issue.
Right.
But
because there's always the challenge to say these things without diluting the message.
That's correct. Now, quite a number of people in many parts of the Western world are disaffiliating from the Christian churches because of our stand on marriage, sexuality, life. I lament that. But a worse situation would be if the secular agenda came to be accepted as the Christian teaching.
Right.
So a pagan hedonistic view of sexuality, devoid of obligation, separated from love, separated from obligations to the next generation, the production of life. If somehow that came to be associated with Christianity, that would be a betrayal of our tradition, and it would be disastrous for society.
Indeed.
Perhaps we can turn to a more sort of Vatican-related topic. And the years that you were the prefect of the Secretariat for the economy, you saw obviously reform, attempts at reform, some successes, some frustrations. Where would you say that we stand right now in terms of reform of the finances and the economy in the Vatican?
Well, we've got good, honest men in charge of it.
Important.
We have a methodology, the modern contemporary methods of presenting financial information so that it is possible for the authorities to fairly easily work out where we are. One very important fact is that for years, the Vatican has been spending more than it earns. And it's a moot point as to just how long you can continue to do this.
And in the years of COVID, that's gotten worse, I think.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And so it's not just a question of an annual deficit, but of and this is public knowledge, significant pressures on the pension fund. So
the decline of Peter's pence.
The decline of Peter's pence. Now I think we've made very substantial progress against corruption. But even when you get rid of corruption, doesn't automatically mean you can pay your bills.
Right. Do you have hope for where things are headed right now?
Yes, but I think more needs to be done. Where we're not out of the woods financially yet.
On both the financial side and the corruption side?
I think we've done pretty well on the corruption side. The upcoming trial will throw some light on that. I'm not sure how that'll go or what we'll discover, but I think I think EOR, the bank, is substantially clean. I think the president, John Baptiste François, and Mummy, the director, have done a very good job there. We haven't made equal progress in every other area Vatican finance.
Looking back, is there anything that you feel you would have done differently from when you were in charge of Vatican finances?
That's a very good question. I probably underestimated the ingenuity and the perseverance of the opponents of reform. They're a very mixed group. Some opposed it because they just don't like change. They didn't understand what was being attempted. It was certainly opposed by people who were linked to corruption. I think we made a major mistake when the external auditors were fired and when Libero Maloney, the auditor, was sacked. Now, I never approved of those things, but perhaps I should have fought a little bit harder on both those fronts.
One of the journalists who's watching had a question about whether or not your legal persecution had anything to do with the reforms that you were trying to do in the Vatican. A question from a journalist in the UK.
The simple answer to that is we don't know. It is clear that money did go from the Vatican to Australia, and it's also clear that we don't know why it went.
It's a substantial sum.
A substantial sum. But that's no proof of anything. It might be entirely coincidental, but it's still a situation that's unclear.
Well,
it would be nice to know why the money went, and for people to just explain that, and then we can get on with.
But so far, there's been no explanation.
No.
Perhaps it will come out in the trial.
It just might.
Yeah.
So changing gears a little bit from one scandal to the next, let's talk a little bit about the abuse crisis in the church. And in your opinion, Your Eminence, what do you think needs to happen to bring the abuse crisis to an end?
Well, I'm going to talk most of all about the English-speaking world, which I know more about it. The church authorities have to have a mechanism which is somewhat independent for those who feel they've been abused to complain to. Now, overwhelmingly in the English-speaking world, we've had that for plus or minus 20 years. Just about everywhere in the English-speaking world, there was a dramatic fall in the number of incidents from the 90s or the mid-90s. That's often, we're not given credit for that. You could say in terms of preventing the crimes, we broke the back of the problem in the middle 90s. Now, of course, the suffering continues. People need, might be financial redress, psychological help. So in that sense, we're still working through that. Now, I'm not sure that the progress we've made is in the English-speaking world is been equally apparent everywhere else. I just don't know. The sexual abuse crisis is a symptom and a cause of wider problems.
Yes.
The decline of the number of churchgoers and the number of percentage of people who believe in the Western world cannot be linked totally to the abuse crisis. The problem of increasing unbelief preceded the crisis and will outlive the crisis. And what do we need to do? We need to follow the commandments. We need to practice what Christ taught. We did that, there would have been no sexual abuse. You know, the authorities would have faced up to the problem in truth. What the church was doing in terms of muddle and cover up 20 years ago was generally done in all of society then. Now, that's not excusing it, but it is setting it in the context. So we've got good people working in this area. It's a very difficult and fraught area, very difficult. The judgment of people can become quite warped through years of exposure to so much suffering. But I believe that certainly in the English-speaking world, we're on the right path. And Cardinal O'Malley's international committee is certainly heading in the right direction.
You mentioned that statistically, the frequency of accusations, at least in the United States, I know from the John Jay report, et cetera, started to decline in the 80s and went down quite dramatically. Even though, as you say, the pain and suffering obviously continues. But to what would you attribute that decline? I mean, it was before it was a public issue. It was around the time at the beginning of John Paul II's papacy that the number peaked and then started to go down. And I've never heard a good explanation for what within the church or within society might have caused that. Because I don't think in the society as a whole, the numbers were going down. They're not going down now either, as far as I know.
I wasn't aware of a decline from the 80s. I don't dispute your figures. Certainly amongst the Australian bishops, we started to talk about the problem in the late 80s, and we started to move with an increasing coherence, very imperfectly, until the middle 90s, when we acted quite decisively in Australia. So I think those efforts, they mightn't answer your question, but they did have an effect. Now we might move to, I think the presence and the teaching of John Paul II about moral truths has
the climate that he created, so to speak.
Yes, in the Catholic Church, he made it quite clear that he believed there was such a thing as right and wrong. Now, the Soixante-Huitard, the 68ers in Paris, there's now a great scandal because so many of them
turned out.
Well, no, they were explicitly espousing pederasty.
Yeah.
There's one, Houellebecq wrote about it in one of his novels. There was a famous country house where it was an open scandal. Now, John Paul, of course, the second was a powerful antidote to all that, and possibly, at least amongst believers and in society, that might have had. And of course, I do think it was connected to some extent with the sexual revolution of the 60s, the invention of the pill, the separation of sexual activity, love and procreation. And it might have been that some of the bad effects of that disintegration started to appear in the late 80s as well as the 90s. But I'm not sure of that.
It is something that I have not yet to see a thorough investigation or explanation of why the numbers started to go down, as I say, before there was a real campaign against abuse. It turns out from the John Jay report, at least, that the numbers of accusations started to decline seemingly on their own, which seems very surprising. There must be some
number of offences declined, or the actual accusations.
Accusations, I believe. That there was credible accusations was what they were measuring in that report, right?
Yes, I'm glad you added the word credible, because just judging from the list of accusations can be quite misleading.
Right.
Especially now, when once upon a time, nobody would believe people.
No.
And now, for example, in Australia, we had the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition saying, all the so-called victims, everyone who complains, was believed.
Right.
Now, I think both those extremes are extremes, oversimplifications, because there are a significant number of false accusations. Not all of them malicious, but memories damaged by decades, drugs, alcoholism, great suffering.
Sure. Have you been in touch with other people, other priests who've been falsely accused? I mean,
yes,
people reached out to you?
Yes. There's a very significant number, and of course, in many cases, that's not made public at all.
And they might be in jail as well.
Well, some, yes, there's one at least very famous case in the United States, I think Father McRae. Now, he would be certainly free if he confessed to have done what he says he never did.
He'd be out of jail.
He'd be out of jail. Would have been out of jail perhaps 15, 20 years ago.
Is that right?
Do you have any suggestions for a protocol or recourse for priests who are accused and by perhaps in ways that are not credible? Is there some kind of system that you recommend be developed, or what can be done?
Well, I think get a good canon lawyer, get a good civil lawyer. In our world, we have the presumption of innocence. And that just to be, and due process is vitally important. Denouncing somebody in the press so they've got almost no chance of defending themselves is, I think, a violation of due process. The victims have a right to due process. Everybody has a right to the truth. And in the long term, it's the best protection for the victims too, is truth, because the more major cases which are manifestly fraudulent, it poisons public opinion against the genuine victims.
You've seen, quite a few popes come and go. Just looking at the last three, John Paul II and Benedict and Pope Francis, I was wondering if you could share with us sort of insights into their personalities, mode of government, that might help journalists, in other words, understand the situation of the church today, the uniqueness of Pope Francis, the contributions of Benedict and Jean Paul.
Well, they have three very different personalities from different nations with quite different strengths. Pope Francis has a great gift of empathy and sympathy. I went with him very early, the C9, the group of advisors to which I belonged. We traveled with him to Assisi on his first visit to Assisi. And we started the day by meeting perhaps 40 or 50, I don't know how many, adult patients who were seriously disabled mentally. And he embraced every one of them and greeted their accompanying healthcare, the nurse. And he does have that a great capacity to show that he is with people who are suffering and in trouble. John Paul II was one of the greatest popes in history, of course, and
What would you see as his fundamental strengths?
He was a public leader. I was
Natural-born leader.
Yeah, whether he's natural born or grew into it, I don't know, but he was a great leader. And he was an actor. He could speak publicly. I was in bed listening to his inaugural sermon in the square. And I turned it off after I said, we're right.
Really?
We've got
the Pope we need.
We've got someone.
Really? In 1978.
78.
Yeah.
And I was right on that particular issue.
You were a bishop then, or priest?
No,
You were a
no.
priest.
Yeah, very much a priest. Now he's often his greatest accomplishment is often that he helped bring down the communist world without violence. Nobody could overstate the importance of that. But I think he made an equal contribution stabilizing the Catholic Church in the Western world against the sort of flood of incoherence and confusion and
from the 60s
liberalism
and 70s.
from the 60s and 70s. I was just trying to get the stats. I was saying to people 30,000 priests left then. And I went back to some of my notes. And in my notes, I said 100,000 priests left. And I was asking one or two people, which of those is right? And the people I spoke to said, no, I think it was 100,000.
Oh.
But even if it's only 30,000, that's not mentioning religious. That's a massive hemorrhage and confusion and the disarray. And there was a radical church collapse, say, in Holland and Belgium and in Quebec.
Right.
Now I was frightened that was going to happen in Australia. And we're pleased, thanks be to God, it didn't.
You stemmed the tide.
We managed to slow things down, but he was aware of that and contributed mightily right across the board to that happening. So I think that
to changing the direction, or at least slowing down.
It's changing the direction and saying, we stand or fall with the apostolic tradition. And I think that's the issue now. Whether you're talking about the synodal way in Germany or the plenary council in Australia, there's two options. Do we stand with and under the apostolic tradition to defend it and support it? Or do we believe we are the masters of the apostolic tradition? We can change it and improve it. And I don't think we can.
And your experience in prison told you the Catholic package works.
Exactly. We
We should have confidence in that, you're saying.
Absolutely. And it won't be easy and it won't be quick. But we have the answer to the sufferings of the secular society. And sufferings there are plenty.
Yeah. And Benedict?
Benedict, prodigious intellect, a dear friend. I knew him better than all the other two popes.
He came to Australia for the World Youth Day.
He came to Australia for the World Youth Day, stayed with me. So I was able to dine with him. I occasionally speak a little bit erratically, exaggerate for emphasis or a little bit of bluster. So he was very expert at restraining my exuberance and correcting me when he thought I was
making the appropriate distinctions.
That's right. Yes. He will be a doctor of the church. He's a great writer and
You say that you knew him better. Are there any moments that you recall that perhaps people would be surprised to know about Benedict? Because people have, I think, an image of Benedict that's somewhat, of a distant figure, you know?
I think people would be perhaps a little bit surprised, but pleased, you know, to hear the way he would tease me or correct me.
He has a good sense of humor.
He does have a good, quiet sense of humor. He's a very, very pleasant gentleman. I mean, there was talk of him when he was at the Doctrine of the Faces, de Panzer Cardinal, you know, riding roughshod over people. He's a Southern German of the old school, very much an academic and a priest to his fingertips.
Did you have any suspicions that he might resign?
No, none
Out of the blue.
It was for me, yes, and I never really approved of it either.
Your Eminence, the journalists who are watching us today, they are coming from all over the world, and in fact, we're invited to submit any particular questions that they might have for you. And so to continue our discussion about the popes, I want to share a question with you from Mikko Ketela, who's a professor of church history at the University of Helsinki. And the question is, why is there so much opposition toward Pope Francis among conservative Catholics?
Well, that's a very fundamental question because I think a lot of conservative Catholics feel a little bit confused, a little bit uncertain. They wonder just what is being taught. Pope Francis has a great gift, like Jesus did, of reaching out to those on the peripheries, the sinners, in inverted commas, in categories that are not always seen in the front row at church, and that can and has confused people. But we are where we are, and we have to. The papacy is something I believe that's willed by Christ. We have to respect the office and reverence the man and obey the papal directions.
Thank you.
Along a similar line, another one of the journalists submitted a question. She's the Rome correspondent for the Epoch Times, Bree Dial, and she asked about the causes of polarization in the church today, and what would you recommend in terms of, for Catholics, navigating the plethora of news sources in and out of the church, especially with the internet and all the websites that are dedicated to the church? And how does a Catholic know what to believe?
Well, I think ask someone whose judgment you respect, whether it's a priest or an academic or a senior layperson, and say, who are the authors that are worth reading so that I've got a good balanced take on what is happening, whether it be from the left or the right or the radical center. What is important, I think, is regular courtesy, a regular commitment to the truth, to dialogue, debating, arguing about the issues. Not in Australian football, we speak about playing the man. That is rather than
The ball.
rather than the ball. And you know, we shouldn't get into personal abuse, demonizing people who have a different point of view. Mind you, the issues are very important, and I don't think there can be any compromise on the fundamental issues of what is the apostolic tradition. But having said that, that's got to be explained. There is a hierarchy of truths. Not everything is equally important. I mean, the divinity of Christ is much more important than whether angels have 2 or 4 wings. You know, we'll give us a foolish example, but the hierarchy of truths is important, and we shouldn't be disagreeing violently over too much at all, but certainly not over matters which are of less importance.
Would you say, I think many people would say that the anonymity of the internet, of not being face to face with one's interlocutors, has contributed to a violence in the rhetoric?
Absolutely. And I think society will be forced to do something about that. The abuse and the violence that can be dished out anonymously and from all sorts of directions, from the extreme left and from the extreme right. But certainly people who espouse traditional Christian views can be exposed to enormous violence in social media. I can think of one Australian woman who has done marvelous work against the premature sexualization of young girls. And she's been inundated with abuse in the social media. But we should stand firm. We should not let bullies, carry the day on those issues. But I think society will have to restrain the anonymity in some way. People answer for what they're saying.
Would there be any sources, whether it's articles, books, websites, anything that you would recommend to journalists, especially younger journalists who are trying to come to grips with the church? Books that you've read recently that you thought were, particularly insightful, perhaps, or?
Well, I think Ross Douthed's book on decadence. I think as
for Westerners,
for Westerners, I think Eberstadt is
Mary Eberstadt.
I think her writings.
She's a convert.
Is she? Yeah. Yes. I think her writings, the connection she makes between family disintegration and the woke cancel barbarism, I think is fascinating and real. George Weigel always writes well. The Benedict option is not my option. Dreher's book is certainly worth.
Even if you disagree with some of the conclusions.
Yes, yeah, I'm not sympathetic to just a small little elite church. I would like to keep as many of the semi-religious slobs like myself
Stay in the
stream. One of my not bizarre enthusiasms, but I'm very sympathetic to Constantine, the first Christian emperor. A very imperfect man.
Why? But why the sympathy?
Because he changed the currents of public opinion. And I'm all in favor of currents in public opinion helping to carry weak people like myself in the right direction. When every current in public life is hostile to Christianity, it makes it just so hard for young people to hang on to even a good foundation.
Only heroes and martyrs will be left.
That's not the Catholic tradition.
Right.
That's not the Catholic tradition. I mean, if we're reduced to that, so be it. But that's
we shouldn't want it.
But we certainly shouldn't want it. And I think with the proper leadership, there's a market for people who not enormously strong faith, but have a great respect and a love for basic Christian values, and realize instinctively just how worthwhile and true they are, even though they mightn't practice their faith as perfectly as they would like.
Right.
And the same journalist, Bree Dale from the Epoch Times, looks at social media from a different perspective. She asks a question about Catholic journalists who are engaging in clickbait or tabloid style gossip, and noting that Pope Francis has called that a form of terrorism. She says that what should be done? Should there be investigations, for example, of reporters who have been factually discredited? And then she points specifically to your case, the coverage of your trial. And should these journalists be permitted to maintain their credentials at the Holy See Press Office?
I'm inclined to say yes.
Mhm.
I think I believe in freedom of the press. Often I don't like what is being said, but I certainly wouldn't welcome a world where the only things that could be said are political correctness, and I wouldn't welcome a world where the only things that could be said would support my version of Christianity. So I think the Vatican should be very, very loath to restrict anyone, no matter what their views. Now, views are, I'm not suggesting they have to put them in the front row, but I believe in a free press. It comes at a price. I'm not in favor of abuse as a contribution to public discussion. But for people who are committed to truth, debate, and sometimes robust debate, is very important.
Well, her question goes on to ask if, in your opinion, if you believe that the Vatican itself should have particular ethical standards that they hold journalists to.
Guess what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
I've heard that one before.
Another one of the journalists asked if you are still a climate change denier.
I have never denied climate change. I am a very strong believer in climate change. I'm well aware that during the Middle Ages, the Rhine River dried up twice. I'm well aware that it was warmer at the time of Christ than it is now, and in the medieval warming, that it was probably as warm as it is now. I'm well aware in one of the warmings, there was a 14-year drought in Australia.
Wow.
What I am against is inflated ideas that we can do very much at all to mitigate, to change these immense natural patterns. No computer program forecasting the future of climate change has been accurate. Not one of them. That
it's a new science after all, right?
I don't know whether, yes, well, chaos theory. We don't know just how it is working. And I'm much more sympathetic to the approach of a man like Lomberg, who says, let's see where we are. And instead of wasting money massively on this, that, and the other thing, when we see where we are, then devote your resources to trying to cope with the new situation. So no, the climate has warmed slightly over the last 200 years. Very inconveniently, it stopped warming for a significant period recently, for perhaps 10 or 15 years. But it's a fascinating subject, and I think there is a vast distance between the evidence and the
policy recommendations.
And I know people get a bit cross with this, but I think it's pagan people like something to be frightened of. And
is that a general rule?
Yes, yes. And there's an instinct in human nature, and we can see in history, to try to placate hostile gods. And I think we're seeing we're seeing manifestations of these things in people who pride themselves in being explicitly irreligious.
Your Eminence, our next question comes from Estonia. Dr. Marge Marie Pass, who is the Director of Media and Press Relations for the Catholic Church in Estonia. She talks about the reality that the church there is a very, very small community and the challenges that go along with keeping the faith alive there, with making a tiny church visible there, especially in a secular society. And she'd like to see if you have any recommendations for how they can do that better. And also, she would like to hear about your comment. You said once that faith kept me alive. So she's wondering how the faith can keep her community and the whole church alive, especially amidst scandals and issues in the church.
Well, the scandals are damaging. There's no doubt about that. And we've just got to concentrate on what we don't preach ourselves. We preach Christ on his message. If we followed Christ's teachings, we wouldn't have the scandals. I would say to that lady from Estonia, you're going to need communities for the adults to support one another. You're going to need the communities for the young people. So I would suggest that, for example, they speak to the neo-catechumenal way. It's a tough, disciplined outfit, but they, in many, many ways, they resemble the first communities. See, the Roman Empire was much worse than ours, much more hostile in every sort of way to what we stand for than we are today. And yet the faith
Took root.
took root and spread. And it will today, with groups like Opus Dei, Neo-Catechumenal Way, Comunione Liberazione, the group, you need community. And the youngsters need a community of peers, so that when they're rebelling against their parents, they've got other people who sort of share the Christian view, who they can support one another and bounce off one another. So if we do what Christ wants, we're always in with a chance of a revival. History is full of religious revivals. There is no religious revival in a Christian sense when Christ's teachings are ignored or watered down, or it's Christian vitality. When we're attached to the vine, you can get growth. If we're separated from the vine, we'll just go out of business. And as I say to the young people, if there happen to be any of these young people listening, today, the situation is quite simple. Unless a percentage of your young people come forward to lead, we will go down the drain. So to the young people who know Christ, love the church, we need you.
Perhaps we could end. I think we're running out of time, but taking that same idea one step further, imagining that one of these young people becomes a bishop. What would be your sense of, what would you recommend to someone who is taking on the role of governance in the church today? What would your message for a new bishop be?
Well, preach and teach Jesus Christ and his teaching. And look at what's happening in your community. Is it growing? Is it...
Those would be the key questions.
The key questions. And as a bishop, you're going to have some sort of strategy to try to produce growth. You just don't do what everybody else has done for the last 10 or 20 years.
What would you use as a measure for growth? What would be the key sort of?
Well, people in the church.
Attendance.
Attendance is not the be-all and end-all. Formal affiliations and disaffiliations, baptisms, marriages.
Vocations.
Vocations, of course.
And then a strategy addressing those.
That's right. I once remember reading about a diocese which was in catastrophic decline, catastrophic, because of the social forces around it. You know, and some of the people discussing the diocese said it was very well run. And I knew exactly what I knew exactly what they were saying, but it's quite misleading. You know, it was like saying a bank that is losing money is very well run.
Right.
Well, they might be saying they're doing their best, they're very good people, but it's not working.
Right.
So, and of course, you've got to believe in the supernatural, believe in the importance of prayer. God loves us. I think it was Mazenod, the founder of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, said it's not too difficult for us priests to live as practical agnostics.
That's a good warning.
It is, yes, it is. It is.
Not just for priests, but for bishops as well, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an enormous pleasure and a privilege, really, to have you with us, and for your generosity with your time and your wisdom and your experience. And I know that the journalists, I'm sure, have learned a lot from listening.
Good, thanks, Father John. Thank you, Ashely.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
Good.
I should mention that next week we will be having another of these special sessions of the Church Up Close with a roundtable of journalists, John Allen, Sean Patrick Levitt, and Nicole Winfield. That will be held at the university, since they're all here in Rome next Thursday as well.
So these are certainly a wonderful little taste of what the Church Up Close is like in person, the opportunity to have these excellent discussions, to go deep into understanding the church, and of course, how a journalist can begin to learn how to cover it in an accurate and profound way. So, Your Eminence, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
And one last point for the journalists is that remember that this is a special session of the Church Up Close, and next year, we usually alternate years. Next year, we will be returning to our normally scheduled program, so to speak, which is a week-long session in September of 2022. And so look for the news of the registration that will be coming out in the spring.
Mark your calendars now.
Exactly.
And many thanks to our Sunday visitor for making this all possible. So with that, we bid you all arrivederci. We thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next year in Rome. And before that, on Tuesday, the 28th, for the roundtable discussion. Take care.